His only request was for his neighbor's son to stay off his lawn. Within moments, she was shrieking, filming, and dialing 911. She claimed he was a menace, and soon, the pulsing red and blue of police lights washed over the manicured lawns, flashing against white picket fences and parked SUVs. It was meant to be a peaceful Saturday in Brookhaven Estates, but now the entire neighborhood was holding its collective breath. A pair of police cruisers were positioned in front of DeAndre Collins' house, their engines humming with a low, ominous thrum. The officers were speaking with a woman brandishing her phone. Still recording her name was Melinda Keene, the sort of neighbor who never missed an HOA meeting. The kind who ensured your trash bins were at the curb by precisely 7 a.m. She was now trembling with unbridled fury. The words she hurled didn't align with the quiet, composed man standing before her. DeAndre wasn't raising his voice, nor was he moving a muscle. He just stood there, arms at his sides, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were heavy with the look of someone who had endured this type of accusation before. "Sir," one officer stated, "she's claiming you made a threat." DeAndre let out a dry, humorless laugh born of pure disbelief. "A threat, officer?" I simply informed her that I have video footage of her son destroying my property. That is all I said. Melinda's voice cracked, her tone defensive. "He's just a boy. You terrified him." The younger officer glanced between them, uneasy, as the tension in the air grew thick enough to cut. Neighbors emerged on their porches, phones raised and recording, and you could feel a palpable wave of judgment spilling across the street. It was a mix of hushed whispers and feigned concern, until one of the officers finally asked, "Do you have that footage, sir?" DeAndre nodded, pulling out his phone. His hands were perfectly steady, not because he wasn't angry, but because he refused to give anyone the satisfaction. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. He pressed play, and on the screen appeared a teenage boy, Brandon Keene. He was seen hopping a small fence, his sneakers kicking up clods of dirt. A garden light toppled. He smirked, and then another light shattered beneath his heel. The boy strode across the grass as if he owned the place before disappearing into his own backyard. The officer watched the footage in silence. He said nothing, but his gaze shifted to Melinda. She blinked, frozen, as the rhythmic click of a nearby sprinkler filled the void. He didn't mean to," she stammered. "It was an accident." DeAndre kept his own tone perfectly level. "He has done it 3 times this week." For several seconds, nobody spoke. There was only the faint electronic buzz of phones recording. That, and the silent sweep of flashing lights bouncing off car windshields. Then, slowly, the officers took a step back. "Okay," one said carefully. "No arrests will be made tonight. We'll file a report. This looks like a misunderstanding." Melinda's mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. "A misunderstanding?" "He approached my son. He asked him to stop cutting through his yard," the officer replied, his voice now laced with weariness. "And he has proof." At that, something in her composure finally broke. She turned away, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She whispered something under her breath that no one could make out. DeAndre stood there for another moment, trying to breathe through the anger that sat like a stone in his chest. Not anger at the police, not even at her. It was anger at how quickly the situation could be twisted, how his simple act of standing up for himself had become a scene with flashing lights, and neighbors filming as if it were a television show. One of the officers walked over. "Sir, I'm sorry about all this. Just try to keep your distance, okay?" DeAndre nodded once, his expression grim. "Trust me, officer, that's not going to be a problem." As the patrol cars finally receded, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the neighborhood. Doors clicked shut, and curtains twitched back into place. The cold, blue glow of a television flickered from a nearby window as DeAndre, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the night, turned toward his own porch, where his wife Monica had cracked the door open. Her eyes were wide with concern. "Are you all right?" "Yeah," he muttered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I'm fine," he insisted, but she moved closer anyway. "You shouldn't have been out there by yourself. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she whispered, her voice laced with a quiet dread. "But that's not always how they see it." He offered no reply. Instead, his gaze drifted back toward the Keene's house, where Brandon's bicycle lay abandoned on its side near the driveway. Behind him, a shattered garden light flickered feebly, a pathetic beacon that seemed to mock the evening's chaos. while from the hallway, he could hear the hushed whispers of his children. Their curiosity finally won over. His daughter's small voice broke the silence. "Dad, why were the police here?" He knelt down to her level. "Because someone made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" she asked. "The kind grown-ups make," he said, "when they forget how to listen." Sleep was impossible for DeAndre that night. He sat alone in the living room, endlessly scrolling through his phone, hoping the quiet would finally drown out the ghost of wailing sirens. But the silence was a lie. The videos were already online. A neighbor had uploaded the entire confrontation to the local community Facebook group. The caption read, "HOA incident on Cedar Lake Drive. Man yells at teenager." And the comments flooded in, a torrent of instant judgment. "That guy needs to control his temper," one read. A few defended him, pleading, "Watch the video before you judge." But opinions were irrelevant now. The narrative was set, and the damage was done. By morning, the story had spread like wildfire through Brookhaven Estates, fracturing into a dozen different versions, none of them holding the complete truth. But before it escalated to this, it all began with something small. A simple fence, a handful of garden lights, and a boy who believed the rules were for everyone else. On paper, Brookhaven Estates was the suburban dream personified. Every lawn was a perfect clone of the next. The mailboxes stood in uniform rows, and the HOA newsletter arrived on heavy, expensive cardstock. It was always topped with a cheerful quote about community harmony. Each Saturday morning, you'd see the familiar sights: retirees strolling with their little dogs, young families setting up lemonade stands, the collective hum of lawnmowers providing a constant droning soundtrack. But that harmony, as DeAndre had come to learn, was a carefully constructed illusion. It was a fragile piece, one that only held as long as everyone meticulously stayed in their designated lane, mowed their lawns on schedule, smiled at the influential neighbors, and swallowed their frustrations when something felt wrong. DeAndre and his wife, Monica, had called this place home for 6 years. They had saved for nearly a decade to afford that house a 2-story structure with unassuming beige siding, crisp white shutters, and just enough room for their children to finally have their own space. It was far from extravagant, but it was wholly theirs. And for the most part, they genuinely liked their neighbors. Well, most of them. Directly across the street were Howard and Denise Loomis, a pair of retired teachers who offered a friendly wave every morning and brought over homemade cookies during the holidays. Then, 2 doors down, was Mark Keene, Melinda's husband. He was rarely home, but unfailingly polite when he was. And then, there was Melinda. She was an HOA board member, perpetually armed with a clipboard and an opinion on everything from lawn height to parking etiquette. She had a particular way of smiling with just her mouth, while her eyes remained cold and calculating. For a long time, DeAndre made a conscious effort to stay on her good side, following every rule to the letter, keeping his hedges perfectly trimmed. He even ensured his trash cans were always hidden behind the fence. Yet, she always found a reason to correct him, sending formal letters about supposedly overgrown grass that was 1/4 of an inch too tall, or citing unapproved garden lighting. At first, he would just laugh it off with Monica. "I suppose my lights are a menace to the neighborhood's aesthetic," he'd remark. But the humor was a thin veil for his weariness. A quiet exhaustion hung over him, which only deepened when he pulled up one afternoon to find Melinda positioned in front of his yard. Her phone was aimed squarely at his house. He lowered the car window. "Everything all right? Just documenting for the HOA report," she replied. She answered without even glancing up. "And for what, exactly? Your mailbox is tilting slightly." He just stared at her for a moment, trying to discern if she was serious. "It's a mailbox, Melinda, not a national monument." She offered a strained smile. Rules are rules. This was the kind of neighborhood where you learn to choose your battles carefully, and DeAndre, for the most part, preferred not to fight at all. His days were spent in the digital world, working remotely from his home office, untangling code and managing networks for a Raleigh-based logistics firm. He found comfort in his quiet routines, the morning jogs, sharing coffee with Monica on the porch, and losing himself in small weekend projects around the house. His own children, Kendall and Ari, would often be out on their bikes, part of a roaming pack of neighborhood kids that included Melinda's son, Brandon. Initially, Brandon just seemed like any other teenager, a bit loud, but ultimately harmless. Then the small disturbances began. A mysterious scratch on the car door, a a basketball that vanished from the driveway, footprints trampling the flower beds. DeAndre held his tongue, reasoning with himself that kids were just kids, and they all made mistakes. But when his new garden lights began turning up shattered, he had a very clear idea of who the culprit was. Even so, he held back, determined to have undeniable proof. He couldn't afford another confrontation with Melinda, not after years of accumulated minor frictions. Then, one evening, while routinely checking his security footage, he saw it in stark black and white. Brandon, headphones on, oblivious. He cut straight across the lawn, and with a casual swing of his foot, shattered a light, never even breaking stride. DeAndre just stared at the screen, the breath leaving his chest in a long, slow sigh. Why can't people just teach their children some basic respect? He muttered. Monica looked up from the kitchen table. You saw him, didn't you? Yeah, I'm going to speak with him tomorrow, he decided. Keep it calm, no accusations. Just be careful, she warned, her voice hushed. You know what his mother is like. I'll be perfectly civil, he promised. This isn't about her, it's about what's right. The very next morning, as if on cue, DeAndre saw Brandon, same hoodie, same defiant shortcut across his lawn. He stepped onto the porch and raised a hand. Hey, Brandon, you have a minute? The boy froze, clearly caught off guard. Sure. Yeah? Listen, DeAndre began, deliberately keeping his tone level. I'm going to have to ask you to stop cutting through my yard, all right? You've also broken a couple of my garden lights. Brandon's gaze dropped to the ground as he scuffed the dirt with his shoe. I didn't mean to. It's just a faster way home. I understand that, but the sidewalk is there for a reason. The kid nodded, his eyes nervously flicking back toward his own house. Okay, sorry, DeAndre managed a faint smile. It's all right. Just please, respect the property. And that should have been the end of it. A simple conversation, a simple solution. But in a neighborhood like Brookhaven, nothing ever remained simple for long. That night, movement on his security camera caught his eye. It was Brandon again, cutting across the lawn. But this time, he shot a defiant look directly at the camera before taking off. The following morning, another light lay in ruins, its shattered glass glittering like frost on the lawn. DeAndre felt something inside him finally begin to fracture. This was no longer just about his yard. It was about the principle of the matter, the blatant disrespect, the feeling of being utterly disregarded, especially in a place where he meticulously followed every single rule. When he explained it to Monica, she just sighed. You have shown far more patience than most people would. Just try not to escalate things, she pleaded. He nodded, but in that moment, he truly had no idea what worse even looked like anymore. He kept his voice low and made no threats. His only plan was to speak with the boy again on the following day. But this time, it wouldn't be just Brandon making an appearance. It would be his mother, phone in hand, recording a story she had already written in her head. The next morning dawned with a deceptive quiet, the kind of stillness that could almost make you believe the neighborhood was as perfect as the brochure promised. It was a picture of suburban peace, birds perched on a fence, a jogger cloaked in neon, the faint, rhythmic hiss of sprinklers. DeAndre was on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the world slowly come to life, when a flicker of movement across the street caught his eye. A blur of gray and red darted between the properties. It was Brandon again, wearing the same hoodie, taking the same shortcut, carving the same path through his garden. As if it were some kind of public thoroughfare, DeAndre set down his mug and let out a weary sigh. All right, that's enough of this. He crossed his lawn, not with speed or anger, but with a deliberate, steady pace. The boy froze mid-stride. With one foot still on the grass, Brandon stopped. Brandon, DeAndre called out, his tone intentionally calm. You and I have already had this conversation. Brandon shifted his stance, stuffing his hands in his pockets. I said I was sorry, didn't I? You did, DeAndre acknowledged. But an apology doesn't repair a broken light. It only admits you were in the wrong. Brandon just shrugged. It's not that big of a deal. DeAndre glanced down at the shattered fixture near his foot. Maybe not to you, but this yard represents my time and my money. Respect is a two-way street. A silence hung in the air, the kind filled with the fading hope that reason might prevail. But the boy simply looked away. He mumbled something indistinct. What was that? DeAndre asked. I said I'll stop, Brandon muttered, his voice laced with annoyance. Good, DeAndre replied. That is all I'm asking." He turned, ready to walk back to the solitude of his own home. And that very well could have been the end of it, had Melinda not emerged at that exact moment, her voice shattering the morning's fragile peace. "What do you think you're doing?" DeAndre spun around, startled. There she was on her porch, barefoot and defiant. Her phone was already gripped in her hand, its lens aimed at him. Her tone wasn't one of inquiry, it was an indictment, as if she'd just stumbled upon a felony in progress. "Good morning," DeAndre offered, struggling to maintain his composure. "I was just, don't you good morning me?" She cut him off. "Why are you out here confronting my son?" DeAndre blinked in disbelief. "Because your son continuously cuts through my property and breaks my garden lights. I've spoken to him 2 times now." Melinda strode closer, the phone held steady. "You do not get to speak to my child. If you have an issue, you come to me. I tried that last month, remember? You told me to just let boys be boys." Her face tightened, her expression souring. "That is not what I said. It's precisely what you said," DeAndre countered, his voice steady. But his reservoir of patience was running dangerously low. Brandon took an awkward step back, his eyes darting between the 2 adults. "Mom, it's really not a big deal," he started. "Go inside, Brandon," she snapped. "Right now." The boy paused for a second before bolting up the steps and vanishing into the house. Melinda's focus returned to DeAndre, her gaze like steel. "You frightened him by asking him not to destroy my property? You were looming over him. You were raising your voice." "I was not yelling," he stated flatly. "Feel free to review your own recording." Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line as she raised the phone higher. "You need to stop harassing my family, or I will be reporting you to the HOA." DeAndre could only stare back at her, utterly baffled. "I have lived in this house for 6 years and have never had one complaint filed against me. You're the one initiating this. Instead of worrying about notices on mailboxes and flowers, perhaps you should examine your own conduct." That struck a nerve. A crimson flush crept up her face. "I know you're kind," she hissed. "You think you can just intimidate people." "My kind?" he repeated. "You heard me." The venom in her tone said it all. It told him she wasn't talking about homeowners or people who follow the rules. There was a deeper, uglier meaning behind her words. It was a prejudice she would never speak aloud, but couldn't completely conceal. "Melinda," he said, his voice lowering, "I don't want any trouble. I have proof your son has been trespassing. That is all." "Proof?" she scoffed. He simply pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. The video materialized. Brandon, laughing, as a solar garden light shattered under his foot, the tinny rhythm from his earbuds clearly audible. Melinda's face went rigid. For a split second, the righteous indignation vanished. But instead of acknowledging the truth, she pivoted. She doubled down. "You're recording my child without my consent? That's illegal. It's my property, my camera." "It's perfectly legal," DeAndre stated calmly. She took a theatrical step back, her breathing accelerating. "Now you're threatening me." "I'm calling the police," she declared. He raised a hand in disbelief. "Threatening you? Melinda, I am standing in my own yard." But she had already turned, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a man threatening me and my son," she announced, projecting her voice for the entire block to hear. DeAndre's heart plummeted. This was spiraling into something awful. All around them, neighbors were peeking through their curtains. One man down the street began to amble closer, making a show of checking his mail. "Please," DeAndre said quietly, "don't do this. I haven't touched anyone." Her eyes were wide, almost wild. "Stay back," she yelled into the phone. "He's getting aggressive." DeAndre took a deliberate step backward, palms open in a gesture of peace. "You're lying, and you know it." She ended the call and glared at him. "You will regret this," she seethed. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned to walk home, every step slow and measured. Inside, his chest felt heavy, as if he'd just stepped into quicksand and had no idea how deep it went. Monica met him at the door, her expression alarmed. "What happened?" She called the police. Her eyes widened. "You're kidding me." "No," he said, staring out the window. "They'll be here soon." And they were, not 10 minutes later. The pulsing red and blue lights washed over the homes, but what the officers witnessed that evening was merely the prelude. The true pandemonium was set to erupt once the cameras and prying eyes of neighbors entered the fray, long after the first police cruiser had rolled up. You could practically cut the tension on Brookhaven Lane with a knife. Curtains fluttered, and garage doors crept open, just wide enough for a curious eye to peer through, as this wasn't the sort of street where police calls were a regular occurrence. And that very fact made every passing moment feel weighted with significance as DeAndre stood on the edge of his property, hands in plain sight, his shoulders slumped. He was innocent, yet he knew precisely how quickly a scene like this could be warped against him. He could already feel the whispers beginning to circulate. The gossip was already spreading from one porch to the next, like a contagion as two officers emerged, one a veteran, with silver at his temples. The other was younger, still green, and clearly on edge. Evening, the senior officer began, his voice carefully measured. We received a call about a disturbance. What seems to be the problem here? But before DeAndre could utter a word, Melinda's voice sliced through the air from across the lawn. He threatened me and my son. He was screaming at us. The younger officer turned to face her. "Ma'am, could you please give us some space?" She paused for a moment, then folded her arms defiantly, mumbling something about her safety, as DeAndre drew a slow, steadying breath. "Officers, I made no threats to anyone. I have video from my security camera of her son trespassing on my property and destroying my property. I simply requested that he stop. That's all." The older officer gave a slight nod. "You have that footage?" DeAndre presented his phone and played the recording. Both officers observed the screen. No shouting, no hostility, just a man speaking calmly to a youth who was clearly in the wrong, seen laughing as a garden light shattered under his foot. The senior officer let out a slow exhale. "All right," he said under his breath. "It doesn't appear you've done anything wrong here." Melinda's voice turned sharp as attack. "He was filming my child." "Ma'am," the younger officer stated gently, "he's on his own property. That's legally permitted." She blinked, visibly thrown by their refusal to take her side. "So you're just going to let him get away with it?" "There's nothing to get away with," the officer retorted, as DeAndre maintained his even tone. "I just want this entire situation to end. That's all. Then stay away from my son." Melinda snapped back. "You have no right to discipline someone else's child. Then teach your son to respect other people's property." DeAndre fired back, his composure finally starting to crack. The older officer stepped between them. "All right, that's enough from both of you. No one is being arrested. Let's all just take a breath." But the harm had been inflicted. Cell phones were already recording. A woman on her porch across the way was filming the entire scene, while another neighbor whispered to her husband, "That's the man from those HOA letters, isn't it?" Melinda stood taller, still shaking, but now energized by the audience. "I cannot believe this. I'm calling the president of the HOA. You will be hearing from us." DeAndre offered no reply. He simply turned, his jaw clenched, and walked back toward his house. Inside, Monica was at the window, her face etched with worry. "You handled that the best way you could," she said softly. "It won't matter," he muttered. "They'll just twist the story to fit their narrative." Their daughter, Kendall, peeked out from around the corner. "Are the police gone?" "Yes, sweetheart," DeAndre confirmed. "They're gone." But tranquility did not return to the house that night, nor the following morning. DeAndre awoke to the incessant buzzing of his phone, a flood of messages, notifications, and group chat alerts. But one in particular caught his eye. "You might want to take a look at the neighborhood Facebook group." He tapped the link, and there it was, a shaky, out-of-focus video filmed from across the street. The caption painted a damning picture. "Man confronts teen and gets aggressive," cops called. But the footage was a lie, conveniently omitting the beginning of the story. It began exactly as Melinda was screaming, with DeAndre attempting to defend himself. The comment section was a battlefield. "Why is a grown man yelling at a kid? He should have gone through the HOA," one wrote. People need to learn to control their temper. But there were voices of support in the chaos. "Watch the video again," a defender posted. "He wasn't yelling. The mom called 911 for no reason. She's just playing the victim card." Ultimately, it didn't matter which side anyone took. The damage was done. Everyone now knew his name, his face, and the location of his house. It was plastered all over social media. Later that afternoon, he saw Brandon riding his bike, head down, eyes fixed on the pavement to avoid his gaze. DeAndre fought the urge to call out, to tell the boy that none of this ever had to happen. But he couldn't. Not when another misunderstanding was just one word away. A few houses down, Melinda was standing in her driveway, glued to her phone again. She turned the instant she saw him approaching. Her glare was sharp enough to cut glass as she spun around and disappeared inside. By evening, an official HOA email had been sent to the entire neighborhood. It was a reminder that all neighborly disputes must be handled through proper channels, and that direct confrontations were strongly discouraged. No names were used, but everyone knew exactly who it was about. That night, Monica rested a hand on DeAndre's shoulder. "You did the right thing," she assured him. "They'll see that." He just stared out at the dim glow of his garden. The shattered light remained by the fence, a stark reminder. "Maybe," he murmured, "but right now, it feels like anything but." The following day, a message came from a local blogger, offering him a chance to tell his side. He ignored it. This was never about becoming a spectacle. All he had ever wanted was fairness, a measure of peace. But peace is a fragile thing, easily shattered when pride, perception, and proof collide. And in Brookhaven, by Sunday morning, that collision had become a deafening roar. The narrative had spun out of control, taking on a monstrous life of its own. That video, filmed from across the street, had been shared dozens of times. It started in the neighborhood Facebook group, then bled onto local community pages, and finally landed on a small online blog under a damning headline. HOA dispute escalates. Mother calls police after confrontation with neighbor. They hadn't used his name. But in the tight-knit community of Brookhaven Estates, everyone knew exactly who the neighbor was. DeAndre sat at his breakfast table, paralyzed. He stared at his phone, watching the comments build, one on top of the other, like bricks in a wall being built around him. A few defended him, most did not. Typical aggressive behavior. He probably terrified that poor woman. Why didn't he just call the HOA? Monica entered, placing a plate of eggs before him. "You have to stop reading that." "I'm trying," he whispered. "But it's impossible." His kids were in the living room, their silence a clear sign they were listening. They had seen the flashing lights, heard the raised voices, and now their father was the man the entire neighborhood was whispering about. The doorbell chimed. DeAndre froze. "Are you expecting someone?" Monica simply shook her head. He rose slowly, peering through the window to see two uniformed officers on his porch. "Morning," one of them said as he opened the door. "We're just following up on the incident from yesterday. Mrs. Keene has filed a statement." DeAndre rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache begin to throb. "A statement? For what?" "She claims she felt threatened, said you were yelling and got too close to her son." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped him. "You saw the video," he shot back. "You know that's not what happened." "We did see it," the officer replied carefully, "but protocol requires us to check in. We're not pressing charges. We just need to advise both parties to stay clear of one another." "Believe me," DeAndre retorted, "that's the only plan I have." After they departed, he leaned heavily against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the perfectly manicured street outside. Every home appeared serene, utterly ordinary. Yet, behind those closed doors, he could almost feel the poison of gossip spreading like wildfire. Later that afternoon, he found himself driving to Home Depot for new garden lights. It was supposed to be a simple, mundane errand, but even there, surrounded by shelves of hardware, his mind was a vortex, replaying every moment, every word. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't laid a hand on anyone. He had simply asked for a little respect, and somehow that had been twisted into a 911 call. When he returned, Monica was waiting on the porch. Her phone was clutched in her hand. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of concern. "Melinda just posted on the HOA page." He set the box of lights down with a thud. "What is it now?" "She's claiming she had to protect her child from a hostile neighbor. She said you were confrontational and threatening." DeAndre's stomach plummeted. "She's painting herself as the victim," he said, the words tasting like ash. Monica nodded grimly. "And people are buying it." Later that evening, he finally opened his laptop, pulled up the HOA group, and there it was, her lengthy post, crafted in that polite yet venomous language she wielded so well, the kind of language that made her sound calm, composed, even noble. "Yesterday," it began, "I experienced a deeply upsetting encounter. A male neighbor approached my son in an aggressive manner, causing me to fear for our safety. I was left with no other choice but to involve law enforcement." Beneath the post, a flood of comments appeared. "So glad you're safe, Melinda. You just never know with people these days." Another read, "You absolutely did the right thing by calling the authorities." DeAndre stared at the screen, his fists clenching as he started to type a furious response. But then he deleted it all, knowing anything he said would only fuel the fire. Later that night, Monica found him sitting in the silent, darkened living room. The television was off, You can't let her win by staying silent, she said softly. I don't want to turn this into a public spectacle. She already did, Monica countered. He finally looked up at her. What is it you want me to say? That I'm angry? Because I am. That I'm tired of being painted as something I'm not? I am. But what good does it actually do? Monica sat down beside him, resting a hand on his knee. Maybe the truth isn't loud enough for some people, she said. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. He gave a slight nod. Maybe. The next morning, DeAndre decided to do something small, yet symbolic. He began replacing every broken garden light, one by one, and the sound of the screwdriver twisting into the fresh plastic was strangely calming. He wasn't doing this to prove a point to her. He was doing it for himself. Across the street, Melinda was standing on her porch again, phone in hand. This time, she wasn't filming, just watching, her expression impossible to read. DeAndre glanced up only once, then immediately returned to his work. That afternoon, the HOA president, Robert Gleason, sent an email to both of them. It was a summons for a special board meeting to address the recent community tensions. Monica read the message out loud. Attendance is mandatory for all parties involved. DeAndre sighed heavily. Great, just what I needed. A neighborhood trial. That night, as he turned off all the lights, he could still see the phantom glow of police headlights flashing in his mind. The piercing reds and blues washing over manicured lawns, illuminating the faces of neighbors who never really knew what they were looking at. They only saw what they wanted to see. But when that HOA meeting arrived, people would finally have to pick a side, and the truth would, at last, have a chance to speak for itself. By Tuesday morning, the story had metastasized from neighborhood gossip into a full-blown community spectacle. The HOA group chat was completely flooded. The Facebook post had surpassed 300 comments, and a few residents had even started arguing publicly at the park. Now, everyone had an opinion. This included those who hadn't witnessed a single second of the video. DeAndre had become Time's neighbor, the one everyone whispered about but offered a strained smile to in person. Every single walk to the mailbox felt like moving through a thick cloud of silent judgment. A few neighbors would nod politely, others would quickly look away. The fake smiles were somehow worse than the hostile stares. When he stepped outside to take out the trash, he could hear fragments of conversations drifting through the air. I heard he became aggressive. She's just trying to protect her kid. They always make it about something else. He didn't need to hear the rest. He'd learned a long time ago that people only see what they want to see. Monica met him at the front steps, holding a tablet in her hand. You're trending on the neighborhood app, she said, her voice flat. He groaned. You have got to be kidding me. I wish I was. Someone edited a clip from our security footage. It's only the part where you're talking to Brandon. They cut it right before you showed her the video on your phone. DeAndre rubbed his eyes in exhaustion. So now it just looks like I'm scolding him. Exactly. And they added text over it that says, "Man confronts teen aggressively." He took the tablet, staring in disbelief at the distorted footage. It was a surreal nightmare, watching himself be painted as the villain in his own life. A few edited seconds of video had completely undone hours of his patience. All that proof and restraint erased. Who posted it? He asked. An anonymous account, Monica said. Probably someone in the HOA's inner circle. He didn't answer, just set the tablet aside and slumped onto the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring into nothing. The neighborhood appeared exactly the same. Perfectly trimmed hedges, flags fluttering, the rhythmic ticking of sprinklers keeping time. But the very atmosphere had soured. It was no longer a community. It had become a public stage for his humiliation. Across the street, Melinda emerged with a bag of groceries. She froze when she saw him, and for a tense moment, it seemed she might say something, an apology perhaps, or even a truce. But instead, she broke eye contact and hurried inside without uttering a single word. Inside, Monica was pacing like a caged animal. We can't just sit here and take this, she urged. You have to fix this before it gets any worse. How? He shot back. Every time I try to explain, they just twist my words. They don't care about what's true. They care about the narrative, she said firmly. So tell your own. Post the entire video. He hesitated, the gravity of the act sinking in. That will just make it explode even more. It has already exploded, she retorted. At least this way, people will see what actually happened. DeAndre sat in heavy silence for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Fine. That night, he uploaded the complete footage, entirely uncut. It was unedited and time-stamped. He refrained from adding any captions or inflammatory titles, just the video with one short message. This is what actually occurred. Make your own judgment. For the first hour, there was nothing. Then, the view count began its ascent. First dozens, then hundreds. Comments started pouring in, a mix of those offering apologies and others doubling down in defense. I take back everything I said. This man was calm the entire time. She completely lied about being threatened. This right here is why cameras matter. But there were still plenty who refused to see it. He probably edited the footage. It doesn't matter. He shouldn't have even spoken to her kid. He still comes off as aggressive to me. By midnight, the video had eclipsed 1,000 views. Monica sat beside him on the sofa, scrolling through the endless stream of comments. At least people are finally seeing the truth now, she said softly. Some are, DeAndre replied, his voice weary. But the truth isn't what people really want. They want sides to choose. The following morning, as he left for work, the HOA president, Robert Gleason, was waiting by his mailbox. We have that meeting tonight, Robert said. I'm asking you to keep things calm. DeAndre raised a skeptical eyebrow. Calm? I've been calm since day one, Robert sighed. I know, but you need to understand this neighborhood. People gossip, emotions are high, and Melinda's been a resident for a long time. I've been here 6 years, DeAndre stated evenly. Long enough to be afforded the same respect. Robert nodded, looking deeply uncomfortable. Just show up. Say your piece. Let's just get this over with. That evening, the HOA clubhouse parking lot was jammed. Every single seat inside was taken. Every phone was charged and ready to record. DeAndre walked in with Monica by his side, feeling every eye in the room lock onto him. Melinda sat with her arms crossed, surrounded by a small legion of sympathetic neighbors. At the podium, Robert cleared his throat. We are here to address the recent incident between two residents. Let us please keep this civil. The chatter in the room instantly ceased. DeAndre could hear his own heart pounding in the sudden silence. Melinda spoke first. I just want to say, I never meant for this to go so far, but I was simply doing what any mother would. I was protecting my son. Robert gave a slight nod. Thank you, Melinda. Now, DeAndre, would you care to offer a response? DeAndre rose to his feet, his movements both steady and deliberate. I did not come here for a fight. I came here because I believe in what's fair. I asked her son to stop destroying my property. That was all. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't touch a soul, and I have the footage to prove every word. He angled his phone toward the screen. The video played its picture clear, its tone calm, its truth undeniable. The room fell silent, the only sound being the faint crackle of the broken light in the recording. When it concluded, DeAndre looked up. All I have ever wanted was to be treated with respect, not special consideration, just simple respect. There was no applause, there were no boos, but something had definitively shifted in the air, a quiet, dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, they had all passed judgment too quickly. Melinda sat frozen, her jaw tight, her eyes darting to the floor. But while the room was finally confronted with the truth, what came next wasn't forgiveness. It was fallout, and it would land harder than either of them could have possibly expected. The HOA meeting was over, but its presence lingered like oppressive humidity in the air. DeAndre and Monica walked home in a weighted silence, passing endless rows of manicured lawns and motionless, watching porch lights. No one waved this time. People just stared, their expressions cautious, unreadable, pretending they weren't thinking exactly what they were thinking. Once inside their house, Monica dropped her keys on the counter. You conducted yourself perfectly, she said softly. DeAndre loosened his tie. It doesn't feel like it. Half the people in that room refused to even look at me. They saw the video. They know the truth now. Maybe, he said. But knowing something and caring about it are two very different things. He slumped at the kitchen table, his head in his hands as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a bitter mixture of anger and exhaustion that made his chest feel heavy. This wasn't just about the lights or the HOA anymore. It was about how terrifyingly fragile fairness really was. Across the street, Melinda's house was dark, but for the cold flicker of a television seen through the blinds, DeAndre caught himself wondering what she was thinking. Was she embarrassed, regretful, or just plotting her next move? He wouldn't have to wait very long to find out. The next morning, a thick envelope from the Homeowners Association was taped to his front door. Inside was a letter. It was written in Robert Gleason's careful handwriting. Dear Mr. Collins, due to recent community tensions, the board recommends mediation between you and the Keene. Family, please refrain from further direct contact in the meantime. He exhaled a sharp, frustrated breath. Mediation? Like we're two kids on a playground. Monica skimmed the letter. At least it's something. Maybe this will stop her from spreading more rumors. DeAndre stared out the window. Or maybe it's just their way of keeping her comfortable. He didn't reply to the notice right away. Instead, he poured the rest of the morning into mowing the lawn and replacing the very light bulbs that had started this whole ordeal. He did anything that would give his hands something to do while his mind replayed the last week in an endless loop. Later that afternoon, while he was trimming the edge of his lawn, his neighbor Howard, the retired teacher, walked over. The man, who always wore suspenders and spoke in a low, careful voice, stated the obvious. "Rough week, huh?" Howard said. "You could say that." Howard leaned against the fence. "For what it's worth, I watched that video. You didn't do a single thing wrong." DeAndre looked up, surprised. "You saw it? Everyone's seen it," Howard said, his tone heavy. "But admitting what it truly revealed is another story. Folks around here prefer their quiet, even if it's a quiet built on pretending nothing is wrong." DeAndre gave a slow, knowing nod. "Yeah, I'm starting to understand that." Howard sighed. "You held your own better than most would have. Don't you let her get to you." It was a small gesture, but it resonated with more significance than he'd expected. It served as a reminder that not everyone in Brookhaven was content to watch from the shadows, yet the oppressive tension refused to break. That evening, Brandon went outside to shoot hoops in his driveway, and DeAndre heard the distinct thud of the basketball. It echoed off the concrete, rhythmic and steady. For a brief moment, he debated walking over there. Maybe he could try to talk again. But then, Melinda appeared in her doorway, her eyes locking onto his. She didn't utter a single word, but her message was delivered with perfect clarity. He turned and went back inside. Dinner was heavy with silence that night, punctuated only by the kids' talk of school. They chattered about who was chosen for the science fair and who wasn't. But beneath it all, DeAndre could feel their gazes on him. They were measuring his mood, the way children do when they're trying to read the atmosphere. After dinner, Kendall's soft voice cut through the quiet. "Dad? Yeah? Are we in trouble?" DeAndre carefully set his fork down. "No, baby, we're not in any trouble." "Then why did the police come to our house?" Monica reached over, her hand covering Kendall's. "Because sometimes adults make mistakes, and they don't always know how to make things right." Kendall paused, thinking. Did Mrs. Keene make a mistake? DeAndre looked at his daughter, her wide, brown eyes filled with an untarnished innocence, and he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "She did." That night, long after Monica had fallen asleep, DeAndre sat alone on the porch, where the new garden lights cast a faint, cold glow. They illuminated surfaces that were smooth and untouched. The air was thick, still. Somewhere in the distance, a lone dog barked. He opened his phone and looked at the video post again. It had fallen from the digital world's grace. People had moved on. No new comments, no lingering outrage, just an unnerving silence. He thought he should feel relieved, but instead, a heavier weight settled in. It was the specific kind of emptiness you feel when you realize the viral drama everyone obsessed over was your actual life, and now it's just forgotten. Just more debris floating aimlessly in a digital sea. He glanced across the street again. Melinda's porch light was off, but he could just make out her shadow moving through the blinds. Perhaps sleep was eluding her too. Maybe guilt looks the same, from both sides of the street. The next morning, Monica found him still sitting there, his eyes red from a sleepless night. "Come inside," she said gently. "You have to get some rest." He stood up slowly, taking one last look back at the quiet street that had been altered so completely in just a handful of days. But silence is not the same as peace. And the next HOA meeting was about to prove that some people would rather protect their own pride than ever face the truth. The HOA clubhouse had never felt so packed. Rows of folding chairs lined the back wall to handle the overflow. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, and the air crackled with a low, humming tension. What was supposed to be a routine meeting about budget updates and landscaping contracts had become something else entirely. Everyone knew the real reason they were gathered there. DeAndre sat near the back with Monica, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He'd sworn to himself that he would not lose his composure, no matter what was said. But as his gaze swept the room, it landed on Melinda, sitting right at the front, chin high, posture perfect, with a printed packet of incident notes resting on her lap. He knew that promise was on the verge of being shattered. Robert Gleason, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat from the podium. All right, everyone, let's come to order. We'll address the regular agenda items first, and then we'll proceed to the discussion regarding last week's neighborhood dispute. A few people whispered and someone coughed. No one was truly paying attention to the agenda items. Everyone was simply waiting for the fireworks to begin. After 15 minutes of procedural talk that barely registered, Robert finally said, "All right, let's move on to the matter between Mr. Collins and the Keene family." You could have heard a pin drop. Before Robert could even finish, Melinda stood. "I'll start," she said, her voice smooth yet undeniably strained. "I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I never wanted this to become a public spectacle. I was simply protecting my son." She glanced back, her eyes meeting a few sympathetic nods. "My son is 16. He made a mistake. He walked through someone's yard, but the way he was approached was completely inappropriate. No parent wants to witness their child being intimidated like that." DeAndre kept his gaze fixed and steady, his jaw tight. Melinda continued, "I have lived in this neighborhood for over 10 years. We've built a strong, respectful community here. But lately, it feels as though some people no longer understand boundaries or how to communicate properly." "Properly?" someone murmured under their breath. Robert cleared his throat. "Thank you, Melinda. We appreciate your perspective. Now, DeAndre, would you like to respond?" DeAndre rose slowly, and every eye in the room turned toward him. "Sure," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "I've lived here for 6 years. I've paid my dues and followed every single rule. I've fixed everything the HOA has ever written me up for, even when the complaints made absolutely no sense. I've kept quiet. I've respected everyone here." He took a deep breath. "But respect is a two-way street. My property was damaged on multiple occasions. I asked, politely, for it to stop. I provided proof, and instead of accountability, I got police lights flashing outside my house." A ripple of whispers washed through the room. Melinda stiffened instantly. "You're exaggerating." DeAndre turned to face her directly. "Am I? Because I have the footage. I played it for the police. I played it for this board. I even posted it online so that no one could twist the truth." A woman near the front spoke up. "I watched that video. He wasn't yelling." Melinda shot her a withering glare. "You didn't see what happened before that?" "There wasn't a before," DeAndre retorted, his patience finally cracking. "That's what people like. You do. You rewrite what's plain as day on camera just to protect your own pride." Gasps fluttered through the room. Robert raised his hands. "Let's keep this civil." But the floodgates had already opened. Another man, Dennis Rowe, spoke up from the side. "Look, nobody here wants trouble, but let's be honest. Calling 911 over a conversation? That could have ended very badly." Melinda's face flushed with anger. "I felt threatened." "How?" Dennis asked. "He never even stepped off his own lawn. I shouldn't have to explain how I feel," she shot back. "You weren't there." DeAndre folded his arms. "Exactly. You times felt, times threatened. You didn't times see times a threat. There's a difference." The room fell silent once more. It wasn't anger hanging in the air anymore. It was realization. People were thinking, some looked uncomfortable, others ashamed. Robert exhaled slowly. "All right, that's enough back and forth. Here is what I propose. The HOA will facilitate mediation between both parties with a neutral third-party mediator and will also be updating the community guidelines. The update will clarify how disputes should be reported to prevent this situation from ever happening again." Melinda folded her arms. "So he faces no consequences at all?" Robert hesitated. "There is nothing to punish. The evidence doesn't substantiate your claims." For the first time, Melinda's defiant confidence began to crack. "You're taking his side." "No," Robert stated quietly. "I'm taking the side of the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. DeAndre settled back into his seat, his pulse still hammering, but his expression remained a mask of calm as Monica reached for his hand under the table. She gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze. The meeting concluded with a smattering of half-hearted applause and a sea of awkward smiles as people shuffled out. They moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, unsure which neighbor to greet first. Outside, as DeAndre and Monica walked toward their car, Howard hurried to catch up with them. "You handled that perfectly in there," he said, his voice full of admiration. "I think people finally saw what's really been going on." DeAndre just shook his head. "Maybe, or maybe, they'll just go home and pretend this never happened." But the story was far from over, because guilt has a way of echoing long after the fact. And sometimes, the apology you never expect arrives when there's no one around to witness it. 3 days passed in an unsettling quiet before anything else happened. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm had finally passed. The incessant emails from the HOA had stopped. The explosive social media thread died down, and neighbors returned to trimming their lawns as if nothing had ever disturbed their peace. But for DeAndre, the silence brought no relief, only reflection. He had won, technically. The video footage had completely cleared him. The board had sided with him, and the gossip was finally dying down. But the entire ordeal had left an indelible mark. Every time he saw a patrol car cruise through the subdivision, his stomach would tighten into a knot. Every time he heard footsteps on the sidewalk, he felt compelled to check who it was. That Friday evening, he was sitting on his porch again, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. That's when he saw a lone figure walking across the street. At first, he thought it was Howard, but then he realized it was Melinda. She moved hesitantly, as if uncertain of her own steps, with her arms wrapped tightly across her chest. The sun was low, washing the street in a golden hue. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this walk 1,000 times before actually doing it. "Evening," DeAndre said cautiously as she reached the edge of his driveway. "Hi," she replied. Her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it. "Do you have a minute?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." She remained near the sidewalk, not daring to step any closer. For the first time since all of this began, she looked smaller, not in stature, but in spirit. Her eyes were tired, her posture heavy. "I just came to say I'm sorry." DeAndre studied her face, trying to read it. For what, exactly? She swallowed hard. For everything. For calling the police. For making things so much worse than they needed to be. He didn't respond right away. "That's a lot to apologize for." "I know," she said quickly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. She stopped, her sentence trailing off. She glanced back toward her own house. "I've had people messaging me non-stop since the meeting. Some are defending me, others are calling me things I never thought I'd hear." DeAndre looked down at his cup. "Welcome to the internet. I deserved some of it." She said it quietly. "I let my emotions run ahead of my reason when I saw you talking to Brandon that day. I jumped to the worst conclusion. I didn't think, I just reacted." "You did more than just react," DeAndre corrected gently. "You weaponized fear." Her gaze shot up, a flash of defiance in her eyes, but it softened as she exhaled and conceded, "You're right, I did." They stood in a heavy silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of a lawnmower. "Brandon's been grounded," she finally said. After a beat, she added, "He wrote you a note. I told him he needed to understand the damage his actions caused." She presented him with a folded piece of paper. DeAndre opened it to find a child's messy handwriting and a few short words. "I'm sorry for breaking your lights. I didn't mean to cause trouble." He nodded, carefully folding the note back into its crease. "He's a good kid," DeAndre said. "He just needs someone to tell him no sometimes." A faint, weary smile touched Melinda's lips. "He's stubborn. He gets that from me." DeAndre leaned back against the porch railing. "You know, if you had just come over and talked to me like this, from the very first day, none of this would have ever happened." She looked down at her feet. "I know, but I've been on the HOA board for so long. I think I forgot how to simply be a neighbor." That admission hung in the air between them, honest, painful, and true. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Well, I appreciate you saying that, I really do." Her eyes drifted towards the street. "I've stepped down from the board," she said suddenly. "It just didn't feel right, not after everything. Maybe it's time someone else managed the rules." DeAndre was quiet for a moment, then offered a soft, "That's probably for the best." Melinda gave a small nod and turned to leave. Halfway across her lawn, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You didn't deserve what I did to you. I just hope that one day, the people who saw that video will forget about me long before they forget about you." He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. She went back inside, closing her door gently behind her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, DeAndre felt something other than anger, a feeling that almost resembled peace. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. That night, he recounted the conversation to Monica. She listened without interruption, then asked, "Do you believe her?" "I believe she meant it in the moment," he replied. "Whether she actually changes after this, we'll just have to see." Monica touched his hand. Sometimes, closure doesn't come from justice. It comes from hearing someone finally admit they were wrong. He nodded. Yeah, maybe that's enough. They sat together in the quiet, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the room. Across the street, the lights in the Keene house went out, one by one. The next morning, when DeAndre went out to retrieve his paper, he saw something new. The broken section of fence between their two properties. The very spot Brandon had used as a shortcut countless times was now fixed new wood, clean paint, no gaps. There was no note, no message left behind, just a quiet, deliberate gesture. DeAndre smiled faintly, tucking the paper under his arm. He looked out at the street that had caused him so much anguish. The air felt different, not peaceful, not yet, but lighter. And yet, even when things begin to heal, the question remains. What do you do when a single misunderstanding exposes just how fragile trust really is? A week passed, and the neighborhood began to look normal again. Or at least, it pretended to. The lawns were freshly manicured. The mailboxes stood perfectly straight, and the HOA newsletter was delivered like clockwork, this time featuring a cheerful quote about how forgiveness strengthens communities. The author's name was never spoken, but everyone knew. DeAndre glanced at it once, then set it down. The bitterness had faded, leaving only weariness in its place. It was a profound exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in your bones when you've fought a battle you should never have been forced to enter. Life in Brookhaven Estates carried on, but the rhythm had changed. The waves from neighbors were more subdued now. Smiles were softer, the attempts at friendliness a bit clumsy. The very people who had shunned him for a week were suddenly trying to be warm again. A few even ventured over to offer small talk about football, or the weather-transparent efforts to apologize without actually saying the words. He accepted these unspoken apologies with grace, taking it all in stride. He wasn't one to hold a grudge, but he wasn't one to forget either. One afternoon, as he was mending a loose plank on his fence, he saw Brandon again. The boy paused on the sidewalk, a basketball tucked under one arm, and hesitantly said, "Hey, hey," DeAndre returned. Brandon's reply was quiet. "Thanks for not hating me." A small smile touched DeAndre's lips. "Wasn't worth the energy. You learned something from all this, right?" "Yeah," the boy admitted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "My mom told me that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes too." DeAndre nodded slowly. "That's true. What matters is what we do after we make them." Brandon offered a shy grin before returning to shoot hoops in his driveway. It was a simple exchange, but it was one that held significant weight. Perhaps it meant more than any formal meeting or official apology ever could. Inside, Monica was setting the table for dinner. "He talked to you?" she asked. "Yeah, he'll be all right." She gave a faint smile. "Maybe everyone will be." Later that evening, DeAndre found himself sitting outside once more. It was a familiar routine from the past several nights, but this time, the air felt tranquil. The lights he'd painstakingly replaced now glowed with a steady, soft luminescence. The street was quiet, but it wasn't the unsettling silence that follows tension. This was a different kind of quiet one that felt earned. His mind drifted back over everything that had transpired. The shouting, the blinding flashes of police lights, the venomous online comments, the insidious whispers, and then the apology. It was astonishing how quickly things could spiral out of control, how readily people chose fear over reason. And it all began with a single misunderstanding, one flawed assumption, one sentence delivered with the wrong inflection. The truth was, this had never really been about a broken garden light. It was about perception, about whose story was believed first and whose was questioned second. And that, DeAndre realized, wasn't just a problem in his neighborhood, it was a human problem. He leaned back in his chair, watching the glow of a distant porch light flicker across the pavement. Melinda hadn't spoken to him since their last conversation. She didn't need to. Sometimes, silence is its own form of apology. Still, he hoped she meant what she'd said, not for his sake, but for her own, and maybe for her son's. Perhaps this would be the incident that finally compelled her to see things from a different perspective. A car drove past, its pace slow and deliberate. Its headlights swept across the street like a silent, watchful patrol. DeAndre closed his eyes, just for a moment. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt grounded. Just then, Howard ambled over from across the street. In his hand were 2 cans of soda. "Mind if I join you?" "Go ahead," DeAndre replied with a genuine smile. Howard settled into the chair beside him. You know, he began, cracking open a can, people like to think, that neighborhoods are built on fences and contracts. But really, they're built on people deciding how much they're willing to care about each other. DeAndre nodded slowly. Yeah, sometimes it takes a complete mess to remind everyone of that. Howard let out a soft chuckle. A mess or a miracle depends on your perspective. They sat together for a while longer, sipping their drinks in a comfortable silence. He watched the final embers of daylight die out behind the silhouettes of the rooftops as, somewhere down the block, a sprinkler hissed into existence. The sound was strangely tranquil. After a moment, Howard finally said, "You handled that well, DeAndre." Most people would have flown off the handle. A faint smile touched DeAndre's lips. Losing your temper brings a moment's satisfaction, but keeping your dignity is a victory that endures. Howard lifted his can in a small salute. Well put. Once the old man had gone, DeAndre remained on the porch a while longer, contemplating the true weight of this entire ordeal. It was never about winning a dispute, or even proving a point. It was about the lens through which people choose to view one another. It was about how quickly assumptions can poison goodwill, turning neighbors into adversaries, and how a single act of integrity can begin to mend the divide. His thoughts drifted to his children, to the kind of world they were set to inherit. Perhaps it wasn't perfect, perhaps it never could be, but if they learned anything from this, he prayed it was that composure is not weakness, and that truth requires no shouting to be heard. He switched off the porch light, finally ready to close the chapter on the day. The yard, once a battleground, now looked serene. A sense of peace had returned. Across the street, the Keene residence was dark, save for a single, soft light glowing in one window. It was a quiet reminder that people can change, even if the process is painstakingly slow. As he stepped inside, Monica's voice called from the hallway. "Are you coming to bed?" "Yeah," he answered, taking one last look at the quiet street. "I think, finally, I can." Because in the end, this story had never really been about fences, or lights, or homeowner association rules. It was about what happens when people stop seeing the humanity in each other, and sometimes it takes the most discordant noise to remind everyone what respect truly sounds like. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How would you have navigated the situation if you were in DeAndre's shoes? Subscribe for more stories that get to the heart of the matter. Stories that show us how powerfully perception molds our reality, and how empathy is the only tool that can rebuild what misunderstanding shatters. The very foundations that misunderstanding breaks.